Ron, thank you so much. So Thad, I think before we begin, we should probably let folks know that I'm not just a journalist interviewing you, but we have quite a history. We were together in Katrina. We were together during the BP oil spill. We have definitely developed a really good professional relationship in addition to a personal relationship. So I think that what everybody is going to see is a conversation here, not only among professionals, but friends. And I think we're going to be able to give a lot of really good insight going all the way back to 9/11 up to where we stand now, and just talking about maritime security, cybersecurity, and how we have worked through so many stories together over the past, 16 years, right?
Couldn't be more delighted to be doing this with you, Kyra. It's always terrific to be with you, and I'm ready to go.
All right, let's do it. Let's go back to 9/11, shall we? And at that time, I was working for another network. I was working for CNN, and I'll never forget the producer coming into my ear saying, "We've got some strange feedback on the radios. We're hearing something about a plane crash, possibly in New York." Well, I'll never forget it. It was in that time period just before 9 o'clock. And ever since then, it has changed our lives completely. And it changed your life as well, not just professionally, but personally. Take us back to what you remember at that moment. Where exactly were you at the time that first plane hit on 9/11?
Well, at the time, I was the commander of Coast Guard Atlantic Forces, and specifically, I was getting a physical at the Coast Guard base across from Norfolk, and I was actually having blood drawn from a corpsman, and there was a break room across the way. And of course, the TV was on. It was on CNN, and the plane hit the tower. A curious event, as everybody originally thought. As things developed, it was clear that we had a significant issue going on. So I immediately terminated what I was involved in and went back to my office and went to the command center, and then everything started to happen from there. But it was, as you remember, it was a clear, bright day, gorgeous weather, and then all of a sudden everything just got shattered.
And our lives changed from that moment on. And explain to everyone what your responsibilities were, Thad, at that time.
Now, the way the Coast Guard is set up from a command and control standpoint, we have a commander of the Pacific area and a commander of the Atlantic area. I was the commander of the Atlantic area at the time. That's basically all of the United States east of the Rocky Mountains, the Atlantic Ocean, and then Pacific area is responsible for the West Coast and the Pacific area over to Asia. So at that point, I was responsible for all the harbors and all of the coastline on the east coast of the United States. So it was a broad area of responsibility, and of course, created a lot of concern right away with the scope of the attacks and what might be going on.
And you had to jump right into action with regard to the areas of responsibility that you had. Why don't we start with New York Harbor and what you knew you had to do immediately? And then let's move into Boston Harbor, DC, and then the broader Atlantic and Gulf coasts.
Sure. First of all, just for the viewers to understand, the Coast Guard command echelons start out at the local port or harbor level. Then there's a regional, or what we would call a district commander, and then the Atlantic commander, which was the job I had. And these commanding officers at the local ports are empowered to make decisions and act autonomously right away when something happens. So I didn't have to actually direct a lot of these activities, but what I had to do was kind of orchestrate them between ports. And to the extent they needed more resources, I had to figure out how to get them to them. So specifically starting with New York, the captain of the port in New York had closed the harbor right away. At that point, you lock everything down. You put units on the water, armed units on the water. And then we started dealing with the issue of all the people that were trapped in lower Manhattan. And what happened after that was probably one of the largest evacuations of individuals, probably in the history of the country, trying to get the folks off of lower Manhattan, either to New Jersey, Brooklyn, or Staten Island.
And also something that you had to consider when you're looking at a mass tragedy like this, you had to bring in chaplain support as well, right? I mean, just talk about all the assets that are immediately brought in when you're taking on a traumatic and massive and chaotic situation like this.
Well, once we had evacuated the folks from lower Manhattan, and by the way, that took a tremendous effort of all the watermen, ferries, and other people operating on the water in New York Harbor. and indicated a lot of work ahead of time to create trust and the relationships needed to be able to organize that so quickly that they did. But the real issue at Ground Zero was it was impossible to resupply Ground Zero with all the debris that had fallen. It was impossible to get trucks down there or any kind of equipment because the tires were blown and the debris was there and access was impossible. We took a Coast Guard cutter that has a crane on it that's used to remove buoys from the water that was tied up in Bayonne. And we moved it over to North Cove, which was about 400 or 500 yards from Ground Zero. And we set that up as a resupply point where we could bring water and the other supplies they needed in, and then be able to just transfer them by hand if we had to Ground Zero. At the same time, my chaplain had been at LaGuardia Airport, and he called me and he said, "What should I do?" And I said, "Get to the Coast Guard Command on Staten Island," which he was able to do with some help. And at that point, we organized all the Coast Guard chaplains that we could get to bring to the area. And then we actually brought them down to Ground Zero and also at Staten Island. And when the firefighters were coming off a watch or their shifts, we were there to make sure they had spiritual support. And then ultimately, when the families were granted access to go to Ground Zero, the Coast Guard chaplains were the one that accompanied them in and helped them at least be able to see the site. Obviously, traumatic for everybody that was involved, but the chaplains were there to provide spiritual support for the survivors that wanted to visit Ground Zero.
When did you realize this was not going to be a short or small operation? Did you have any idea as this was all developing that this was going to be all day, all night, for days and days and days? Did it even enter your mind how the scope of what we were dealing with on 9/11?
Well, I think what entered my mind is probably what entered a lot of people's minds. Is there something else happening? Is there another shoe that's going to drop? Is this part of a large scale attack? Can we expect similar incidents in other cities? So my first thought was, what am I responsible for? Well, I'm responsible for the Atlantic area coastline. And so I started thinking about major harbors like New York, what the threat might be if something were to occur there. And in addition, what we were able to do in New York, what we might be doing at the ports and harbors. So I diverted cutters that were under patrol. And I also had cutters get underway that were able to get their staffing and their people and get refueled and supplies and so forth. And we developed a plan to basically put large cutters off the most significant ports in the East Coast to provide surveillance and command and control in the event there was a more widespread attack than what we had witnessed to date.
And just explain to our listeners and our viewers, Thad, why cutters are so essential, why they are such strong assets in a situation like this.
Well, first of all, cutters are mobile. You can put them where you need them. Second, they have sensors on them, radar, they have command and control and communications. And most of the large cutters that are operating have helicopter decks as well. So they're a command and control communications and logistics platform. And they're available for a lot of different missions. By placing cutters off all the major ports, we made them an extension of the port commanders. So they had eyes and ears and access to information, and allowed them to be able to make sure that they were safely conducting operations and had a better sense of the threats that might be present in and around and on the approaches to the ports.
I think what one of the most amazing things for me as a journalist, especially 9/11, and then when I reported out of Antarctica, and then the war in Iraq, were just all the capabilities of the Coast Guard ships, in particular, the cutters. And so how did you coordinate with other assets? I know you worked a lot with the Navy as well and coordinated with the Navy bases and their assets.
You know, each port had their own set of issues and things we needed to be concerned about. And in regard to Navy bases, I was located in Norfolk where my command was at. And of course, that's the largest Navy base in the world. So in addition to being able to secure the port, there was an issue of force protection for the Navy base itself. So the local commander in Hampton Roads needed to be able to coordinate with the commanding officer of the naval base to make sure that they were secure. And that meant putting armed patrols on the water as we moved into longer lengths of period, escorts in and out of Navy vessels, and then trying to figure out if and when we restarted commercial traffic. which one of those types of vessels need to be escorted by armed boarding teams to make sure there wasn't a threat there. So you kind of had to sculpt the package you needed for surveillance and what it is you might want to be prepared to do in relation to the threat, in relation to every port. If you take a port like Houston, which has a very long, narrow ship channel and a lot of refineries and other petrochemical facilities along there, that's a much different threat. But if you take Houston down, you remove a massive amount of refining capability for the country. So it's like managing a portfolio risk and how do you optimize mitigating the risk and making each port as safe as you can, given the peculiar specific operation of that port and what they did in regard to maritime commerce.
How did you make those decisions? Because a lot of changes were made at Boston Harbor, Washington, D.C. You closed the Potomac. I remember that. And then also the broader look, as you mentioned, to the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. How did you prioritize what harbors to respond to first when you start talking about worrying about a large scale attack and threats via the waterways? How did you decide what areas should be focused on first? I mean, obviously New York, that was a no-brainer, but what about the other major ports, harbors?
There were three major ports that we acted on right away. Of course, New York was obvious. One of the planes had taken out of Boston, so we closed Boston Harbor as well, not knowing what the implications might be there. And then, of course, we had the plane that flew into the Pentagon. So at that point, we closed the Potomac River north of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. And then all these places put armed vessels out on the water to ensure that we could maintain security. In addition, in New York Harbor, once we got the large cutters on scene, we stationed a cutter between the Statue of Liberty and Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. And I have to tell you, I saw something when I finally went up there to visit that I never thought I would see in my life. And that was a Coast Guard cutter anchored by the Statue of Liberty with their guns uncovered. It actually sent chills down my back. And then we had another cutter just outside the Verrazano Bridge until we could understand the extent of the threat and kind of stabilize the situation. Further south, then the other ports we started to deal with were Delaware Bay, which was Philadelphia, and all of the activities along the shoreline there. And then Norfolk, as I mentioned. And then the next priority in my mind was Houston. And then the ports we looked at after that were New Orleans, Miami, other places where there was major amounts of shipping. And again, we tried to do that based on the risks we thought might be to the port itself and the potential damage that might be done.
It's interesting, you mentioned the Statue of Liberty. As we know, the terrorists were headed toward major landmarks for us, right? As Americans, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon. Was there a point where you started thinking about like the Statue of Liberty? I mean, imagine if they would have, flown aircraft into that. I mean, that's an attack right there on what represents all of us as Americans and life in the United States. Was there a concern about essential places like that? And did that impact area of operation?
Not specifically, but as the conversation matured in the days that followed, people started thinking about landmarks and symbolic places that might be the subject of attacks. But the reason the cutter was placed there was basically just for security of Manhattan and as a deterrent to anything else that might be done there, including the vessel was placed outside the Verrazano Bridge. But in the weeks and months and actually years that followed, there was an ongoing discussion about how you protect symbolic places as well. But the original response was all based mostly entirely on the safety of life and making sure that nobody was hurt.
So the Coast Guard has other missions as well. Were those impacted during 9/11? Because I'm thinking of all the assets that were put into protecting the harbors, the waterways, et cetera. What about things like drug interdiction, fisheries enforcement, all these other missions of the Coast Guard? Did that have to go on hold? Did you have to multitask with all the various missions, or was this 24/7 all out thinking about what happened on 9/11 and protecting the country?
Well, it's an excellent question. I like to tell people our Coast Guard cutters are multi-mission. They can do a lot of things, but they can't do everything at once. So what we immediately needed were cutters that were underway that we could move quickly. So in that case, it was cutters that were involved in fisheries in the North Atlantic, cutters that were involved off the Mid-Atlantic, cutters that may have been involved in drug interdiction or migrant interdiction down south. Those are the cutters that were already out there and can move the quickest. So in the beginning, we actually took cutters around those other missions, and those are the cutters we placed at the various harbors. And we called cutters and got the crews underway and then stationed them. Then over the weeks and months that followed, we came up with a rotation so we could sustain that presence. But while we were doing that, obviously, we weren't putting as many hours into fisheries, drug interdiction, or migrant enforcement.
Did that become an issue?
It didn't right away. I would say 3 to 4 weeks afterwards, we started taking a real look at whether or not the fact that we didn't have as many assets down south might be exploited by the drug cartels and moving drugs north, which then prompted a discussion about as we understood the risk and understood that the risk may not have been as apparent as we thought it was on 9/11, we could redeploy some of those assets back, or we had called up reservists and used other assets to accomplish the same purpose from shore. In some cases, we established what we called sea marshals to actually board the vessels and go in and out with them, which precluded us from having a boat alongside. So you try and sustain the operations you have, and you try and redeploy what you've got to make sure you're covering the most important missions. But you're always going to have to make a trade-off, because in the long run, it's kind of endemic in the Coast Guard. You're always managing scarcity.
That's a good point. Sea marshals, also the armed boat escorts, I remember. How did that work, and how well did that work?
Well, it gets back to how you want to protect a particular port, and the highest priority to begin with were the naval assets, and places like Norfolk, Kings Bay, Georgia, and other places where we had high value assets that were moving to and from. We had to make arrangements with the Navy on how we were going to do that. After that, we had to do some risk assessments, and you take a port like Miami, which is the largest cruise ship port maybe in the world, and what do we think the threat is to a cruise ship that may have 3,000 to 4,000 passengers on it, and do they need armed escorts? And for a while, we were taking what we thought were the highest risk operations and providing national armed escorts, boat crews to do that. Then we kind of dialed it back as we got 6 months, a year into it, because we understood now that where the threat was and where we needed to apply our assets to the highest return.
Before that point, though, that's interesting. I remember cruise lines. That was a big concern. What were some of the other highest risk operations that you were concerned about?
Well, to tell you the truth, it was critical infrastructure at that point. When you get past the Navy assets and want to make sure that they have freedom of movement and what they're going to do, where you have ports that have extreme vulnerabilities, like Houston, which has a 30 or 40 mile, very narrow ship channel, and the refineries and the petrochemical facilities. I paid a lot of attention to Houston afterwards, because in my view, there wasn't a single point of failure, but a catastrophic event in Houston would have impact far beyond the port in terms of the refining capacity of the country and the ability to move petrochemicals and oil and gasoline and so forth.
So let's talk about just up to this point, what worked well, what didn't work well. So as operations were fully engaged, what were some hitches that you had to work out in real time that, of course, have helped now, decades later? But what do you remember as some of the things you had to correct in real time that were eye-opening in a situation like this?
Well, actually, we found out that a decision we had taken before 9/11 actually worked in our favor, and then kind of guided our decision-making after that. Prior to 9/11, most of the Coast Guard ports in the country had either 2 or 3 commanding officers. One commanding officer that did search and rescue and law enforcement, another commanding officer that did environmental response and port security, and then a third commanding officer that looked at marine inspection of vessels and licensing of mariners. There had been some talk for a long, long time in the Coast Guard that there shouldn't have to be 3 different commanding officers in a port that our stakeholders deal with. So we actually had set up a prototype, a test command in New York Harbor, where we combined all those commands together to see how it would operate. And I am of the firm conviction that our decision to do that has served us very, very well on 9/11, anywhere from orchestrating and coordinating the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people from lower Manhattan, but being able to bring those resources to bear to help support the operations at Ground Zero. In fact, an interesting side story, I believe that the relationships and the trust that was built that day in New York Harbor actually contributed to the successful rescue of the U.S. airline that Sully and Sullenberger set down on the Hudson River, because everybody had already known each other and operated under contingency conditions and didn't have to be told to act, to just move there. And since then, Sully Sullenberger and I have become really close friends. We've talked about this quite a bit. But the issue of pre-need relationships, getting the command structure right, and be able to effectively respond when you have one of these events occur is stunning. And because of that, every single shore command in the Coast Guard was changed in the years that followed 9/11 to be patterned after the command in New York City.
Wow. So Captain Sully and you then developed quite an interesting relationship. What kind of conversations did you have about that? Did you ever have a moment where you could really go in depth with him on what you had practiced, rehearsed, that prototype prior to 9/11 and then engaging in 9/11 and then what he experienced and was able to pull off that day he had to land on the Hudson?
Well, we become very close friends over the last few years. And at one point, I just said, we've never talked about it before. But I believe one of the reasons that the boats reacted so quickly is that they were used to operating together under extreme stress, and it operated brilliantly as a flotilla, emergency flotilla, if you will, to evacuate the people off lower Manhattan. And just as a quirk, one of the passenger vessels that was first on scene with the aircraft was actually being piloted by a Coast Guard Reserve petty officer. So those are kind of things that are just really interesting, interwoven into the background behind these events. But I think he benefited greatly from the lessons learned and the command structure and the trust in the harbor that was demonstrated on 9/11.
Well, there's one thing that I definitely know about you, and that is you remember hard workers, you remember names, you remember rank, you remember stories. What do you remember about 9/11 and many of the days that followed that impressed you the most about your men and women in the Coast Guard? The Coast Guard, so many times they're the lifesavers. They're known as the lifesavers, but many times they are kind of behind the scenes. And this was a major event where the Coast Guard was so heavily involved and really showed its muscles in ways that I think Americans didn't realize the diversity and all the different talents and skills the Coast Guard really could bring to the table in a situation like this.
Well, I think one of the skills and talents, you won't see it written in law anywhere about the Coast Guard, is I like to say that we are bureaucratically multilingual, that we can talk to the Navy, we can talk to a fire captain in a city, we can talk to the Marine Police. And I think one of the demonstrated competencies after 9/11 is no matter which stakeholder or client we were dealing with in a harbor, we could deal effectively with them and build a incident command system that was capable of establishing unity of effort in the port. And I think if I were to say one thing overall about the Coast Guard across all the ports on 9/11, it was the leadership of the captains of the port and their crews and the men and women of the Coast Guard, and also the Coast Guard Reserve and the Coast Guard Auxiliary and our civilians that allowed them to basically be flexible and agile in setting up command structures that would include those various interests in the port that varied with each port and make it as efficient and responsive to the mission's demands that they could. I think it's one of the central, most brilliant characteristics of the Coast Guard that's not really well understood by the American public. But I saw it played out and was very proud of the performance of everybody up and down the Atlantic seaboard.
How did 9/11 impact you as a leader, as someone who's been so deeply rooted in the Coast Guard since you were a kid? How did that day and that mission and the days that followed changed you, just not only as well personally, but as a leader in the Coast Guard?
Well, it was a fundamental pivot point in our history, a flexion point, whatever you want to call it. Things were never going to be the same. We've traditionally been separated by our adversaries by oceans. And the notion that there would be a physical attack on the United States was something that the specter was raised in World War II, especially on the West Coast. The Japanese actually invaded and for a while held the island of Attu in the Aleutians. But we had pretty much come to think of ourselves as an island with a wide ocean separating us from our adversaries. And I think what happened on 9/11 was a wake-up call in that we have physical borders and we have functional borders where we try and check and make sure that we're carrying out the sovereign responsibilities of a nation. But that was going to be fundamentally changed. And since the Coast Guard operates very close into shore and then offshore, and then we work with the Navy overseas, I knew right away there was going to be a fundamental shift in what the Coast Guard was going to have to do moving forward. And that became very, very apparent because there were immediate calls in Congress to take a look at the vulnerability of the maritime transportation system in this country. And whether or not there was an attack on it, it was obviously the World Trade Center. What did we learn from that we needed to make changes going forward, that we reduce the risk in our ports?
And let's talk about that. Let's talk about the long-term changes that were definitely made to improve port security following those attacks. And you were sort of going there for a second. Let's talk about the Maritime Transportation Security Act and just the vetting that started to take place through, with regard to access into our country.
Yeah, there were two major pieces. One was legislation. The other was an international treaty or convention through the International Maritime Organization. The Maritime Transportation Security Act basically established legal standards for how to conduct harbor and waterfront security, and it required waterfront facilities to actually produce physical security plans that had to be approved by the Coast Guard on a regular basis. We also established a requirement for access controls to those facilities and vetting of the individuals and actual identification cards being established for the folks that were going to be working there. That became law a year or so after the event. In the months that followed the attacks on 9/11, I actually participated in field hearings in Houston and other places, held by the Congress to inquire into what they should be thinking about and how this legislation was being put together. At the same time, the Commandant at the time, Admiral Jim Loy, was working very, very hard at the International Maritime Organization, which is headquartered in London. And as a result of that, they were able to put together something called the International Ship and Port Security Code, or the ISPS Code, which established higher security requirements for vessels that were calling in different countries that were signatories to that convention. And it also allowed us and other countries to go to ports where ships were leaving to come to the United States and do assessment on the facilities of those ports regarding their security and any risks that might be there. Not unlike what the FAA does with foreign airports, but that did not exist before 9/11.
So before 9/11, also, we never would have imagined that terrorists would have come into our country, learned how to fly a plane, hijack our commercial airliners, and cause mass destruction. What type of scenarios did you start thinking about and being prepared for after that when it comes to the threat of ships? I remember talking to security teams at ports saying, well, you never know what can be brought in through a ship. The next thing you know, it's a massive explosion in a huge port, and you could see another type of 9/11. Is this how you started thinking about security threats after 9/11? What exactly could terrorists do via the waterways on vessels?
Now, there are a couple of different levels of threats and risk associated with that. At the very lowest level, the United States doesn't have a ubiquitous radar system covering the entire coastline as we do for aviation. If you're in a small general aviation aircraft and you're flying and you get above a certain altitude, if you're not checking in with the FAA and your transponder is not demonstrating where you're at, you're probably going to get visited by the Air Force, and they're going to want to know what you're up to. We have never created that kind of comprehensive network, nor do we have one today around the United States. And so some of the early conversations I had, not only after 9/11, but when I became Commandant, was a potential threat from a small boat, either for a physical attack like the Mumbai attacks in India, or the fact they might be carrying some kind of a small improvised explosive device or even some kind of a radioactive device or bio threat or something like that. And I actually pressed very, very hard to have us consider some type of regulatory framework for that. And that extended from my time at 9/11, became Chief of Staff of the Coast Guard and ultimately Commandant. But there is not a real appetite in this country to regulate or restrict small boat movements. And I spoke to a national conference on that after 9/11. And I basically had a very powerful lobbying organization come up to me and tell me, frankly, that driving was a privilege, but boating was a right. So I know I was pushing against a pretty strong lobby there. At the higher levels, there's been significant changes made in safety and the threats regarding containerized cargo and other things. Coast Guard working with CBP introduced advanced notice of arrival requirements, and containers are tracked universally now. And a lot of times, it's not a physical inspection of the container, but it's an interrogation of the data about the container from where it starts through to when it's opened. That became a very controversial issue after 9/11 because a lot of people wanted what they called 100% physical inspection of containers, which would be impossible with the amount of containers that move in this country and the resources we had to do it. So you have to figure out a way to do a risk methodology on how do you actually assess a container from where it begins in a foreign country and where it's opened in the United States, and assess the risk associated with that, including running containers through sensors that detect radioactive devices and other things.
And also too, that I remember changed a lot with regard to training. And I want to step back to, it was kind of a funny story, but it wasn't really a funny story. And you may remember this, and maybe we can go into how the Coast Guard and its training has developed as well. But I remember there were some calls coming through that there was possibly some activity out on the Potomac, and it increased and increased, and it created quite a flurry within our newsroom. And the next thing you know, people were saying there were guns being fired, there were fast boats, that there was something that was in some high threat situation, fully engaged in DC on the Potomac. And everybody, the first thing that went through everybody's mind, you might remember that when I told you this story, was that, oh my gosh, are we being attacked on the waterways now? Is this another 9/11? I mean, that everybody was so worked up. So a friend of ours, as you know, was working in the White House, and I called up and I said, what is going on? What is happening on the Potomac? And he said, it's training. So it was this training that all of a sudden freaked everybody out. And it did for a moment start to become a national story until I was able to get clarity and come on the air and say, hold on just a second, it's training. But could you go into that part of enhancing security and protecting our ports and waterways, because training has also taken on a lot more now, and the way it's done and the intensity level.
And despite the fervor of that day, I guess I would classify that under the rubric of no good deed goes unpunished. When the planes flew into the Pentagon, we did not have a continual presence in Washington, D.C. And I was dual-hatted on 9/11. I was the Atlantic commander, but I was also the local district commander for the Mid-Atlantic area of the United States. So Washington came under my purview as well, although I had other people working that problem because there were other things happening. But we were trailering boats from other units around the Mid-Atlantic area to maintain a 24-hour presence to enforce the security zone north of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. In the long run, we knew that was unsustainable. So we took steps to actually, and this is one of the changes we made after 9/11. We took steps to actually establish a Coast Guard station in Washington. Started out as a detachment at Bolling Air Force Base, but now it's a full-fledged Coast Guard station with about 30 or 40 people, and they have a 7x24 boat response. After we did that, then you want them to be prepared. So they would go out and they would actually conduct exercises of how they would act if there was a threat out there. Well, some very well-intentioned folks decided it would be a good idea to do this drill, and they did it at the same time that there were 9/11 commemorative ceremonies being conducted at the Pentagon with the president. So you can imagine the timing was bad. The intentions were good. but the lack of coordination and communications about what was going on certainly caused a lot of real problems at the time until we could actually clarify what was going on. But you're making a good point. The training level we have for armed boardings and conducting security patrols was radically ramped up after 9/11.
And just to stay on that front, when I was in Iraq, I did not realize that the Coast Guard had developed SWAT teams, and they called them Coast Guard SWAT teams. Can you go into a little bit of that as well? That was something that was not around decades ago either, Thad.
Yeah, a couple of things that we did in the Coast Guard, not only following the 9/11 attacks, but the extended military operations in Afghanistan, and then also the operations at Guantanamo Bay with detainees, put additional demands on the Coast Guard as we move further away from 9/11 itself. So in the Coast Guard, we have something called maritime security teams that are capable of doing armed boardings, rappelling off of helicopters and so forth. And we actually have those different places around the country that we can use to actually do a high-risk boarding offshore that's beyond the capability of maybe the local Coast Guard station. We also have patrol boats that are capable of operating offshore as well. In support of the operations that were going to happen in Iraq, we actually transferred 6 patrol boats to Bahrain and set up a command there called Patrol Forces Southwest Asia, which included the patrol boats and these marine safety and security teams who were capable of doing boardings. And at times they were headquartered up in Kuwait as well. We did some of the early security to protect the oil platforms off of Iraq when the invasion of Iraq started. And since that early footprint that we established in Bahrain with the 5th Fleet as part of NAF, CENT, and CENTCOM, we've been there ever since, and we are there today still. Also, when the Afghan detainees were being brought down to Guantanamo Bay, I was approached to provide waterside security for those operations. And Gitmo become kind of a refueling station. And we kept a presence there because of the treaty we had that allowed us to do that. And basically, part of the ongoing tension with Cuba, if you will. But it became a major focus of attention when they decided to place the the Afghan detainees there. So we actually have deployed Coast Guard units down there and done waterside security since 2002 and have maintained that clear till today. So the initial responses and then the needed capacity and capabilities to carry out these missions wherever they are in the world that started after 9/11 and that year, a year or so after that are sustained clear till today.
And it's now it's largely a reserve mission, right? I think we should talk about the reserve mission there now at Guantanamo Bay, because today was the day that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind behind 9/11, was in court. And so in light of that and what's happening in Afghanistan, and now there is this ongoing concern about if Gitmo were to close down, you've got these masterminds behind 9/11 that all of a sudden, what happens to them? Do they end up back in Afghanistan? And then here we go again, looking at the potential of another 9/11 and just jihadists being able to grow and develop. What happens, or as we assess what's happening in the news right now concerning Gitmo and the Afghan detainees and the Coast Guard's mission there, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll leave the legal issues to the legal experts. This has obviously been a vexing international legal problem, both a legal and a moral problem for the world and the country moving forward. To the extent that the detainees were sent to Guantanamo Bay, and until there's a decision otherwise, the requirement remains that the place be secure, both internally and externally. And Guantanamo Bay is basically a Navy base that's divided into 2 parts by a waterway. And we maintained our presence there under a treaty that allows us to stay there as long as, and originally it was supposed to be a coaling station, now it's a refueling station, had become very, very low key in operations, except for supporting drug interdiction operations until 9/11. But since the detainee operations are down there, you need adequate security if you're going to conduct the operations. And that's logically been a mission of the Coast Guard. And a lot of that has been borne by the Coast Guard Reservists that did an admirable job after 9/11 of filling the holes until we could readjust our forces and where we needed them. The Reservists also helped us in we have certain ports in this country that are designated as breakout ports for military equipment going overseas to Iraq or Afghanistan. So in places like Charleston and Port Arthur, Texas, and other places, the reservists were called up and actually helped us secure those ports. So a lot of that material, equipment, and ammunition and so forth could be shipped out safely. So can't say enough about the reserve support following 9/11 and the continued reserve support we get in the Coast Guard.
Do you see a lot of men and women wanting to serve longer, serve more, get back into serving? Did you see that impacted over the past 2 decades?
Oh, we did. And immediately after 9/11, we saw a huge growth in our reservist force. And a lot of those people were policemen and firefighters. And it's not unusual to have Coast Guard reservists that are from those two occupations. They kind of go together. If you want to have a military service that kind of complements what your professional occupation is, if you're a firefighter or a policeman, being in the Coast Guard Reserve is a really complementary way to manage your profession and your career. And we've been very, very lucky. We're getting to the point now where after 20 years, a lot of those people are reaching retirement age. And we have a lot of people in the Coast Guard now that are in the Coast Guard that weren't even born when 9/11 happened. And so they're coming into a much different Coast Guard and being raised in a much different Coast Guard than the one that I was raised in, but one that continues to focus on our port security responsibilities. And basically, we have raised a whole generation of new Coast Guard men and women that have been trained and are very, very skilled in carrying out those security operations now.
20 years later, then, twofold question. First of all, 20 years later, has the threat changed?
Well, I think it has. Following 9/11, the legislation that was passed, including the Homeland Security Act that created the department, was focused on a physical attack, physical security, airline security, especially vetting of airline passengers. There were issues that created the critical infrastructure. And as we all know, there were a number of laws that were passed related to surveillance and privacy in order to get the kind of signals we needed and the intelligence that would protect the country. I think what we're starting to find out now is that we're dealing with more and more threats that are agnostic to physical borders. And by that, I mean threats that don't understand what U.S. sovereignty or U.S. border is. And frankly, you can include the weather and germs and the internet and all of that. You don't have to be physically present in the United States right now to threaten it or carry out an action. You can have a cyber attack that produces a kinetic outcome. Let's say an attack on a power grid or a waterfront facility that actually has a physical consequence associated with that. And I think what we have to deal with right now is a dual domain risk environment that we operate in. One is a physical security environment, but the other one is what I would call a functional environment where people can actually get inside your borders and your domain and cause things to happen without physically being present there. That's a radically different concept that we dealt with on 9/11.
Where do you think we are the most vulnerable right now in the maritime domain?
Well, I think the entire maritime supply chain, and it's not generally well known, but 90 to 95% of all the goods that come into this country come by ship. We saw what happened when the international supply chain was interrupted by the container ship that got stuck in the Panama Canal. And even today, with issues related to COVID and where materials are at in the world concerning supply chains, we have unprecedented backlogs in container ships at ports like LA Long Beach. And we all know what's in short supply when you're looking at how you're either whether it's in construction or computer chips for automobiles and so forth. So this integrated maritime transportation system that links to rail once it gets to this country is extraordinarily important to the point where it's hard to distinguish between what's a national security issue and what's a domestic security issue. And so from where I sit, the vulnerability of the maritime transportation system, and I'm not talking about just ships, I'm talking about ports, containers, trucks, rail, bridges, and all the data that connects all those things together in a supply chain, being vulnerable to cyber attack or cyber attack that messes with, say, industrial control systems that could cause actual physical disruption of a port. And we saw a few years ago with the labor disagreement in the port of LA Long Beach, the consequences of a port shutdown in LA Long Beach are frankly in the billions of dollars a day. So it's extraordinarily important. And I think we probably need to keep rethinking the maritime transportation system and the threats to that as we move forward.
I know cybersecurity has been a really big thing for you, and you've talked a lot about it. You've told me, I mean, we've done lots of stories because of what you've taught me and others about that the threat, the cyber threat. Let's start with not just our security, but you have pointed out time and time again what kind of impact it can make on our economy if we do not follow the cyber threats, because of how those can impact transportations of goods and services. Of course, we're going to see the impact on our economy if we don't pay close attention to the threats that are out there. So what are you looking at? What are you monitoring? What's on your mind when you think of how it could have a tremendous impact when you talk about the billions of dollars on our economy?
Well, it's interesting. A couple of years ago, I was on a panel with General Keith Alexander, former head of NSA, and he made an interesting statement. He said, I think we're in the process of redefining what provide for the common defense means in the preamble of the Constitution. And I think I would add to that, where I think we're redefining what constitutes the general welfare. If you look at a massive attack on our financial systems, it takes down the ATMs and the ability to get access to banks. It's not going to be very long until you're going to have civil disorder associated with that. The same as if you look at the loss of power after currently Hurricane Ida and the implications of that just for a couple of weeks, you have catastrophic damage to a power grid. At a certain point, you're going to start encountering civil disorder and large impacts to the general welfare of the population. I think there's a fusing, and cyber is a good way to think about it, of national security with the general welfare of the public. And at some point, we're going to have to make a determination that this is a national security issue, not just an issue regarding the financial sector. And when we put these things at risk, we're actually introducing some significant problems that could bleed over and produce internal discord. And of course, our adversaries would love to take advantage of that. So I think we need to have a more holistic look at what's going on in the country and how these things are actually connected together. Because of the Internet of Things and everything that's going on out there, the information and connectivity is ubiquitous. And while it facilitates our lives, it also creates a huge attack surface for our adversaries.
All right, so I want to get back to cyber security in just a minute, because that is sort of what we've talked a lot about, years after 9/11. But backtracking just for a second, as we approach the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, the Taliban is now once again in charge of Afghanistan. U.S. troops have left. I think you'd have to be living under a rock not to know what's going on in that country. And we have heard a number of our leaders within the military say that they have a tremendous concern about jihadists in the region and just the growth of anti-American sentiment, and that we could go backwards and see these jihadists build again, and we could very well see another 9/11. This question is threefold, but let's start there. And as we go back to 9/11 and what occurred on that day, and where those terrorists came from, and where they grew and they built and they trained for that day, what are your thoughts about Afghanistan now back in the hands of the Taliban?
Well, I'd say, first of all, we need to understand the history of how Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were operating in Afghanistan on 9/11. And it goes well back, much further in history. The Muslim Brotherhood being involved in the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the evolution of that group, and what we're finding out over that time period, which was 30 or 40 years, folks that have demonstrated animosity and a willingness to act need a place to be able to plan, need a base of operations and so forth. And they've tended to gone to ungoverned areas. That's for a while. Osama bin Laden was in the Sudan and went to other places and finally ended up in Afghanistan. We need to be aware of any place in the world where we have a failed state or an ungoverned region, because that's fertile grounds to create operating bases and for these folks to get a place where they can operate from. And we saw this with the rise of ISIS in Iraq after the troop withdrawal there. It's going to take continued vigilance, and we have a lot broader array of tools and technical means to understand what's going on. And you're always going to need people on the ground in some shape or fashion to figure out what's happening. But we're going to have to leverage every type of technology and advance that we've made since 9/11 to make sure we've got our arms around what's going on in these ungoverned region, which is Afghanistan, need to be one of those now. And we're just going to have to understand it's going to require some attention lest we let this thing fester and grow again.
Are you more concerned about our physical security at this point, in light of everything that's going on now, or the cyber threat?
Well, you have to be mindful of both. I think we've got a threshold of security, especially from the aviation side and other transportation systems, that is significantly improved since 9/11. I have remaining concerns about the maritime transportation system because we lack ubiquitous radar coverage and the ability to look at small vessels that may be a threat. But I would expect going forward that groups are going to use any means possible to achieve an effective attack against their adversaries. And if they're precluded from a physical attack by measures we've taken, then they've always got the internet and cyber. But a lot of these activities are inspired through the internet. People that can become lone actors, and that becomes even more of a concern. Of course, homegrown threats as well. One of the interesting things about the internet as it's evolved over time is you don't have to be in each other's presence to precipitate an action by a group. They can actually create an identity, think and act as a group and not be in each other's presence. That's very, very difficult to detect or counter. And I think the inspirational use of the internet to get lone actors and other groups that don't have to be physically located are something we really need to focus on.
Emerging technologies are definitely making it harder to detect these threats. I did a huge, as you know, report on deep fakes. We can talk about that in a minute. But what do you see? What are you seeing as emerging technologies impacting how we can detect possible threats?
Well, it's interesting because most of these technologies cut both ways. They can be seen as a threat, but they also can improve our capabilities to respond and improve our mission performance. I guess the prime of example of that right now would be unmanned systems or drones. It's a huge problem with the proliferation of these devices. The technology has moved faster than legal frameworks can keep up with it. And responding to the drone threat, there was FAA legislation passed a couple of years ago that gave new authorities to Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and so forth on how to counter these things. But the issues related to privacy, use of force, and actually when you detect it and what you can do are very, very cumbersome. And so what we have to do on these emerging threats is we have to become more nimble and agile on how we react to them, including how we look at regulation and law. Because right now, the ability to move nimbly and quickly against a drone strike or a drone surveillance, in my view, is not what it should be. But at the same time, we're trying to be mindful of the laws related to privacy and airspace and everything else. It's not unlike some of the laws that were passed after 9/11 regarding surveillance and privacy. At the time, it was a national interest, and we felt it was the right thing to do. We're kind of going through that same process right now with the use of unmanned systems.
And there was a philosophy at the time when we were talking about UAS and other forms of surveillance on our country and even outside of there was talk about legal rights, civil rights, and how far is too far. And there was a philosophy that, look, do you want to see another 9/11? Well, then we've got to do what we have to do. 20 years later, where do you stand on that? What's your philosophy and thought on issues of privacy and surveillance?
Well, I think privacy and security are kind of two sides to the same coin. they're always going to be in tension, and the question is, are we getting it right? And you can have a major event that causes you to rethink it, and then maybe you adjust, and maybe you have to come back and refine where you're at on this whole thing. Um, right now, I believe the entire focus right now, because the internet is not only a means of attack, but it's a means of coordination, and it's a command and control system that anybody in the world has access to if they want it moving forward. So I think anything that allows us to more accurately identify those threats and deal with them, we should be doing. Issues associated with who holds the data, who has access to it, when do we justify a threat? That's all been handled through the FISA courts and everything else. But I think we need to constantly be reassessing what it is we're trying to do, what the legal thoughts that are out there. We tend to make a decision, and then 3 or 4 years later, the technology overtakes us, and we start having the discussion again. We need to be more agile and quick. We need to be inside the decision loop with these folks on how we react to it moving forward.
And I mentioned deep fakes. How concerned are you about AI, the artificial intelligence, and where deep fakes are going? I know it's not at the level, that has caused really deep concern at this point on some sort of national security level, but the threat is definitely there. I had a chance to go deep inside DARPA, where they are studying this and working on this, and met with some students across the country that have been selected to learn how to make deep fakes, analyze deep fakes, be able to say, is it real, is it not? But when they put it into perspective for me about what a good deep fake could do, you put a deep fake video out of the president of the United States saying, I hate all Muslims and they're all terrorists and let's go to war. I mean, these were the scenarios they were putting in front of us as we were working on this story. I mean, that's pretty scary, knowing how things go viral. And if you can't detect a deep fake, you can, like you point out, you can create world chaos with a 30-second video of a deep fake of a leader, whether it's here or abroad. So how are you following that? How do you see that as an emerging threat?
Maybe I can couch it in a little higher terms. I've had a lot of discussions over the last 10 years on what I call the functional border versus the physical border. And we're dealing with more and more threats that are agnostic to our physical borders, but we still have to carry out our responsibilities as a sovereign nation. And a lot of that is done through interrogation of data. If you look at how we manage the container threat, or even issues associated with personal vetting and personal identification information when people are traveling, that all involves data. So to the extent that artificial intelligence can be used to exploit data, create deep fakes and all that sort of thing, all of a sudden we have the functional equivalent of a physical intrusion. And the point I've been trying to make is we need to get better at functionally dealing with these technologies. You need to be somewhat occupied with the border and physical security, but the real threats that are confounding us right now are agnostic to our borders. And we have to figure out a way to be able to detect them and deal with them in a functional manner, because there is no border for AI, there's no border for the internet, there's no border for germs, there's no border for weather. And so what we've got to do is be able to say functionally as a sovereign nation, how are we going to deal with that threat? Because it's something that can't be dealt with at a physical border. So if you look at AI, and whether it's data itself or video or whatever, you can use that to create all kinds of false access, verification of who people are or what they're doing, that can be used to either as a ruse or subterfuge to get somebody into the country or divert somebody, or as you said, use it for propaganda purposes that indicate that something is happening that is not happening. I think we need to really focus on that. A while back, I led a work group for the Homeland Security Advisory Committee. And the other thing we were looking at, in addition to AI and deep fakes, was genetic engineering. When you look at food safety, animal, plant, and health inspections and all that kind of stuff, are we equipped right now to be able to actually detect, CRISPR technology and things that are used to actually change genetics that create a threat that you can't physically see at an inspection? It makes your brain hurt.
Well, you know what else has made our brain hurt? And that is another threat that you can't necessarily see, and that's the bio threat. Here we are living in COVID. We didn't see this coming either. Let's talk about the bio threats.
Well, there was a rush to look at that after 9/11, and there were sensors deployed, and a lot of work was being done on that. And we also had the anthrax attacks, and there was a lot of public visibility and pressure put on it. I think if you move away from that and you look at just the ability to no matter whether it's done through malintent or naturally through a progression of a disease that moves across the country, we have to have the ability to deal with a pandemic, whether it starts with a bio threat or it starts with a naturally occurring disease that got out of a zoonotic laboratory or transmitted from some kind of an animal colony to human beings. We have started and stopped on pandemic planning at least 3 times in my career that I can remember, and I can actually name the times that it happened. And we lost continuity between administrations because people refused to take what the previous administration had done or maintain continuity of the work that was going on. And I think there's a significant issue, and this is not a Republican or Democratic issue. There's a significant issue about sustaining what we already know and have learned across transition of administrations and being able to carry that on and then take what was been done before and improve it. But that doesn't happen when we don't understand the difference between campaigning and governing and when to stop one and doing the other.
So you said there were 3 different times that there was basically a stop down on looking into the threat of a pandemic?
Following SARS, there was a lot of work done on pandemic planning. When I was commandant, we actually did a major plan for N1. Was it N1? I'm getting the acronym now, but we actually created a pandemic plan in working with the White House and the other agencies because my vice commandant, Vice Admiral Vivian Craig, was pre-designated as a principal federal official. If we had to activate it, she was going to lead it. But we lost that.
H1N1.
H1, yeah, thank you.
There we go.
But those plans did not survive the transition between Republican and Democratic administration. So in some cases, we started over again with Ebola. And in some cases, we started over again with COVID-19, but we don't carry this stuff across the transition of administrations because everybody's coming in and they're suspect of the career people that are there and the work that's been done. And everything's related to the campaign and the vitriol associated with that. And we lose the fact that we need to maintain the resiliency and the capability of the government to operate across these transitions. In my view, it's a significant issue.
Okay, so then that leads me, let me make note of this because I have a thought and wonder if it has even come up. We'll go back to the bio threat, the threats of a pandemic in a minute. But the creation of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, this happened after 9/11. And I guess generally, has it worked? Was creating the Department of Homeland Security a good idea? Let's start there and sort of unravel what we've learned works, doesn't work, and overall effectiveness of DHS.
I believe the department was a good idea. In my remarks when I became commandant, I said that basically the Homeland Security Act is the promise, but it's not self-executing. It requires people that understand the legislation and what it is we're trying to do to actually make it effective on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes we lose that. It's the old the hierarchy of needs of food, clothing, and shelter. We get so caught up with policy stuff, we forget what do you have to actually do to put an organization together in terms of human resources, financial systems, training, and so forth that makes it competent to be able to respond to the policy direction of the people above them. And I think the department is a good idea. It was assembled in haste. President Bush signed the legislation on the 25th of November, 2002, and it mandated that the department come into existence 60 days later. So on the 24th of January, newly confirmed Secretary Tom Ridge actually was in a Dilbert cubicle 1 block away from the White House, and we sent a Coast Guard warrant officer over to give him a travel card, and he was the department. And then on the 1st of March, 2003, all the agencies moved over. So in 90 plus days, we created a department that didn't exist before. And I think to some extent, we've been paying for that ever since because we haven't really ever department's never really got its feet underneath itself moving forward. It's gotten better every year, but at some point, just like DoD had to go through a couple of transitions from when it was formed in the 1940s, including Goldwater Nichols after the failed rescue of the Iranian hostages in Desert One. We need to keep evolving this organization that's responsive to the threats we're seeing today. And that continues to be the challenge for DHS.
And as we know, the Coast Guard was brought under DHS now, moving away from Department of Transportation, now Department of Homeland Security. Was that a good thing, and why?
In my view, it was. And I was not the commandant at the time, but I was designated as the executive to actually move us from DOT to DHS. So I was involved in the negotiation of all the different functions that had to be moved and how we actually transitioned all those functions. And I used to say at the time that the Coast Guard is a better organization because they're in a department with FEMA, and FEMA is a better organization because they're in a department with the Coast Guard. Because when FEMA wants an airplane and they call the commandant, they get it, and you let the paperwork catch up later. So there are a lot of synergies and a lot of potential synergies that exist. I think there's more than a great cost to have the department and have the Coast Guard be part of it. There's never going to be a perfect fit for the Coast Guard in any agency because we're so multi-mission. But I think Homeland Security is the right department. I just think there needs to be a better focus on maturing the enterprise and the structure of the department instead of getting overtaken in each administration by a particular policy that drives operations rather than creating basic capability that makes you capable of doing any operation.
All right, so let's say you were put in charge of revitalizing or adding to or making changes at the Department of Homeland Security. What would you do first?
The Homeland Security Act contains a provision that they do a quadrennial Homeland Security review. There's a quadrennial defense review that's required under the Defense Authorization Act. There have been 2 attempts to do that in the department, but for one reason or another, that process has never got traction. There needs to be a quadrennial review that can drive resource decisions, the development of doctrine, how we operate together, how the department integrates with the rest of the national response structure, if you will. And they've never been able to institutionalize that and use that as a vehicle for moving forward. So in my view, the first step would be start believing what the act says and actually comply with it and do a quadrennial review that comes up with substantive recommendations regarding policy, operations, and resources, appropriations, and so forth.
So the title of this conference is Gathering Wisdom and Experience. As we sort of come to a close with the last final questions here, wisdom-wise, clearly you're retired, but really you aren't really retired because you're still involved with every committee and organization, and you're advising and you're helping and you're supporting in every way that you can in this country. But with regard to wisdom, over the past 20 years, what do you think were the few key things that you learned that made you a better commandant, a better leader, a better advisor? Presidents have called you in, a number of them, for advice, direction. What do you think are some of your biggest takeaways from 9/11 and since then?
Well, I'm currently working on an opinion piece, so I'll kind of pull out the main points because that's exactly what the piece is about. I make the case that we need a national response doctrine. And when I say doctrine, I mean a set of principles by which we believe the country should operate that's irrespective of political positioning. The best example of doctrine in the history of this country is probably the Monroe Doctrine. It was a statement of principle and intent of what the country intended to do. And I think there are a couple of basic principles. And if you're talking about wisdom, what I've been able to glean, I would boil them down into 4 or 5 principles of what we ought to think about in dealing with these problems that we're addressing today and whatever level of complexity they are. The first one is unity of effort. There's a notion in the military, well, actually it's a legal concept, the Department of Defense, of unity of command. When you come in the military, you're required to be able to recite your chain of command from yourself to the president, and you can because it's structured and it's legal. when you get outside Title 10 operations of the Department of Defense, the best you're ever going to achieve is unity of effort, but you can't succeed without it. And that means how do you take various jurisdictions, agency, missions and so forth, and integrate them horizontally and then vertically down to state and local territorial governments, and then pull that together for a unified response that the American public is going to have credibility in. We've been tested very, very hard during COVID because I'm not sure when we've needed to, we've been able to create that unity of effort based on the kind of trust that we talked about the waterway folks did in New York, and then with the landing of the American Airlines plane. So unity of effort is one. The second one would be we have to learn how to delegate some of this down to subject matter experts that are part of government from a career standpoint, and then hold them accountable and let them be the interface with the political leaders and put the best capability, capacity, and expertise we have on the problem and work it. The third thing is we've got a real problem, in my view, with the 10th Amendment. It's not a problem with it. We got to understand what's going on here. The 10th Amendment basically says all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. If you look at what's happened during COVID, it'd be kind of hard to figure out where that line is and how we're actually understanding it. And I think that's room for discussion moving forward. So if you take these sets of principles and you attack them without regard to political affiliation, you're going to start to come up with functionally what do we really need to do to solve the hard problems. It's not just a disaster response or a crisis response. It's any hard problem we're dealing with, because every one of these things, the outcomes have to be co-produced to meet the expectations of the American people. No agency owns the ability to fix it by themselves. And every one of these things becomes a case in applied civics. And sometimes we fail to understand that.
What are you the most proud of when you think back to the Coast Guard's mission on 9/11? Let's start there. What are you, and I know it's hard to boil it down, but what would you say you are the most proud of from that day?
I think the command structure in New York, a couple of years before, I was involved in something called the Longview Project in the Coast Guard, where we opined that we needed to look at the command structure and create a more cohesive, integrated command structure at the port level. And as I said earlier, that played itself out on 9/11 and ultimately became a standard for the rest of the Coast Guard. We made a couple of other recommendations as part of that study, but there wasn't enough political will to implement them. So I would say after you have an experience and you understand what's going on, sometimes you have to have the courage to believe yourself and act on that. If I had learned anything from that, it would be that.
Very rarely, I think as long as I've known you, which is, it's pushing 20 years. I have rarely seen you get emotional unless you talk about the young men and women in the Coast Guard, especially when you talk about the Coast Guard Academy and what you see happening there and all our future leaders. Is there a moment from 9/11 where you just had to sit back, maybe just by yourself for a moment, take a deep breath, where you did get emotional about what was happening in our country and what it demanded from you as a leader and what it demanded from the young men and women within the Coast Guard?
Oh, there were a couple, and I think one of the things you have to do as a leader, you have to take time out every day or so and just sit down and think about those type of things. If you don't reflect and disengage once in a while, you're probably going to be missing something that you need to understand. But if I were to give you one event that maybe stands out in my mind, a few weeks after 9/11, I was scheduled to officiate at the change of command of a Coast Guard cutter. I believe it was up in New Bedford, Connecticut. Standard change of command, but you muster the crew. Everybody walks out, they have swords on. It's a very big event, a lot of protocol associated with it. We like to call it the manners of our profession. And there's a transfer of power. I did it as Commandant. I've done it many, many times over my career. We weren't able to do that with that cutter because it was the one that was stationed off the Verrazano Bridge. So we actually went onto the cutter, the crew mustered. The new commanding officer came over, saluted the other commanding officer, and the outgoing commanding officer was piped over the side into a small boat and left exactly the same way they would do it in World War II. And that's what I guess, if anything hit home to me, was probably that.
And if anyone's listening and paying attention to your background, we should point out that if you do join the Coast Guard, it's very possible you could get stationed there on the beautiful coast of Oregon, which beautifully rests behind your head. You want a little shout out to Newport?
Yeah, it's Otter Crest near Newport, Oregon. And a few years ago, I was going to a reunion of the ship I commanded down in Coos Bay, and I always stop here and admire the view, so I snapped the picture.
Good memories. Thad, anything you would like to add? We touched on so many different points as we reflected on with the wisdom and experience from 9/11. Anything that I might have missed or that you want to make sure you have a chance to say?
Well, when I talk to people these days about leadership or what's going on in the country right now, the first thing I start with is the status quo is an oxymoron. Things are constantly changing, and we can't be shooting behind the target if we're going to secure this country and make it safer. And every time, a good example is when we were attacking the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we were using the tools that were passed after the Exxon Valdez to prevent a tanker accident. In the meantime, Deepwater drilling went offshore and went really deep, and we were using tools to stop a tanker accident. And while we used them and we were moderately successful, we need to start thinking about aiming ahead of the target in terms of the technology we acquire. But more importantly, we need to start having a unified, integrated way to think about the threats to this country and how to deal with them, and stop pointing fingers at each other politically. And the divisiveness in the country right now is just completely erodes our resiliency. And the quicker we understand that, the quicker we can start moving ahead to where this country needs to move.
Well, I definitely learned a lot from you being out there during the oil spill. And I want to point out to those that you were set to retire. You were ready to take your savings, build the home that your wife always wanted, actually start to relax. And President Obama said, not so fast. You're not going to retire. I need you right now. And I think not only did 9/11 change you in so many ways, that and your trajectory, but also that oil spill truly, I know, made an impact on you and the Coast Guard, and the fact that you did push that retirement to continue to serve your country.
It was an honor.
Admiral Thad Allen, man of very few words, but oh, they say so much. What a great conversation. I always love being with you, Thad. I'm so honored that we got to do this for the conference.
My pleasure.
All right, Ron, we're going to take it back to you.